Today we're going to talk about how ecosystems begin, grow, and develop. This process is called succession. The definition for succession is a series of changes in a community in which new populations of organisms gradually replace existing ones. So succession happens in stages over many, many years, hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. There's two types of succession. The first type is called primary succession. This occurs when there's colonization of new sites or new areas by communities of organisms. You should remember what a community is. That's a bunch of different living things coexisting in the same area. In this picture, primary succession is taking place on a bare rock. So there's no soil, there's no dirt, just bare rock. And the first organisms that grow here are the start of primary succession. The development of the rock where primary succession begins can happen in two ways. The first way, if you recall from earth science, is through the formation of volcanic rock. Volcanic rock forms from lava that has cooled over time after a volcanic eruption. The second way we get new bare rock is from glaciers. Glaciers that have retreated and exposed new land or new rock underneath. As you know, as glaciers retreat, they pull sediment and dirt and soil with them to expose rock underneath. The first organisms to colonize a new area or to grow on bare rock are called pioneer species or pioneer organisms. An example of this are lichens, as seen in the picture. Lichens are the first, usually, to colonize new lava rocks. This picture is an example of primary succession. If you start with the left side of the picture, you have your exposed bare rock. And then next to that, several hundred years later, you get lichen and mosses, which are the first primary organisms that begin to grow. Remember, these are called pioneer species or pioneer organisms. Hopefully you can remember that because pioneers were the first people to explore new areas. So these are the first organisms to grow on new bare rock. Hundreds of years after that, you're going to get small herbs and shrubs, so small plants, ground plants. After that, you start to get larger shrubs, larger plants, and some small trees. Hundreds of years later, continuing, you get your larger trees, your jack, pine, black spruce, and aspen trees. And then hundreds of years even after that, you start to get your larger trees, your birch, white spruce trees. A climax community is a stable, mature community that undergoes little or no succession. So this would be a forest, like a deciduous forest that you see here, or a temperate forest where trees are already mature and there's no primary succession taking place. In Virginia, for example, there are climax communities. Most of the deciduous oak and hickory forest in Virginia are climax communities with mature trees, large mature trees, with very little, if any, primary succession taking place. Here's another example or diagram of primary succession. You have your lichens and mosses growing to the far left over here. Those are called pioneer species. Remember, pioneer communities. Then you have several hundred years later, you're going to have your grasses, herbs, small bushes, shrubs, seedlings, the beginnings of small trees. Then you have your medium to large sized trees several hundred years after that. And many hundreds of years later, you get your larger trees. And then you have what's called a climax community, as we saw in the last slide in Virginia with the large deciduous forests. Another type of succession is called secondary succession. This is where you have a sequence of community changes wherein you have a community that is disrupted by a natural disaster or human action. So this can be something that's natural, or this can be something that's man-made, or something that's caused by man. And this is an effort to reestablish the previous community that was there, or to create a new one. This takes place on existing soil. So we're not starting from bare rock. We're starting from soil or dirt that is already there. We're just going to kind of reset the soil or the dirt so that we can grow new organisms. Secondary succession usually happens after, as we mentioned, natural disasters or man-made events. For example, a fire, a forest fire, whether it's a natural fire or an arson fire. Either way, fires will level completely the areas that they overtake. So in this picture, the fire is leveling a forest. After the fire has been contained, or after the fire has been put out, over hundreds of years, the forest will regrow, starting with the soil, not the rock. Another example of this, a man-made example, is when farmers plow their fields to restart their growing for the season. So the farmer has already grown crops there, okay, or there already are things growing in that area, and the farmer will plow it to turn over the fresh soil to start over the growth of new organisms. This is a diagram of secondary succession. Notice there's no bare rock here. We're not starting out with lichens and mosses as we did with primary succession. So here we have our annual plants that are the first things that start to grow, the first organisms we see. After a few hundred years, we're going to start to see perennial plants and grasses, and maybe a few small shrubs here. Next, we start to see more small shrubs, tree seedlings, and other ground plants. Here, next, we start to see softwood trees, like pine trees, that begin to grow, kind of medium, large-sized trees. Finally, after many hundreds of years, we have our hardwood trees, our redwoods, our birch trees, the large trees that you are familiar with that exist in forests. And I know so far we've talked mostly about forests as examples, but these are the best and the clearest examples to discuss when looking at primary and secondary succession, because most people are familiar with forests and how they grow. So we'll probably use this example a lot, and you'll probably see forest examples on your exams as well. Another example here, another diagram, kind of outlines the same things we've been looking at, where you have your beginning grasses for secondary succession, your little small plants, your ground plants, and then your shrubs, and then your medium to large size trees, and then you go into the mature climax community forest once again with your large redwood birch trees. Okay, here's a different example where we're looking at succession in a pond. This is happening over a little over 100 years, about 150 years of time here we're looking at. So this is in 1840. The pond is kind of barren. Notice there's not too much stuff growing around the pond. There's a few little marks here indicative of a few beginning plants. So 30 years later, in 1870, we have a little more growth around the pond here. Maybe some grasses, some annuals. Here in 1900, which is another 30 years later, we have a few more plants growing on either side of the pond. We also have some sediment, which we saw beginning back here in 1870, some sediment and some growth down here at the bottom of the pond. 1930, we have some small trees here, some larger shrubs and plants, probably some little tree seedlings, and then we have down here some of the growth and sediment that's at the bottom of the pond that has continued to increase. 30 years after that, in 1960, we start to get some larger, or some medium-sized trees, I should say. Definite increase in the amount of sediment at the bottom of the pond, and then we have some, of course, your annuals and your shrubs, and then your larger trees. Keep in mind, as this process continues, you don't lose any of the stuff that you started out with. Things just larger organisms tend to grow more. Okay, so this is the same diagram we saw just a moment ago on the previous slide, but this is for a bird's eye view of the pond succession. So notice the key at the bottom demonstrates to you what type of organisms we are dealing with over this hundreds of years period. Um, the key showed you the emergent plants, the pioneer species, if you will, that begin to grow on the outskirts of the pond, and then you have your rooted floating plants that begin to grow kind of more in towards the center of the pond. And then, of course, your rooted submerged plants that are kind of underneath in the bottom of the pond. And then the open waters would be areas where there's very little growth or very few organisms that live there. So notice as succession continues over these hundreds of years, you get less and less open water because there's more organisms that begin to grow. So our last example in talking about succession today is for coral reefs. Coral reefs are beautiful, unique underwater communities where hundreds of different species of organisms can live in the same area. So at the top up here, we have our primary colonization of a coral reef, which would probably be made out of lava rock that has bubbled up from the ocean floor and cooled. Over hundreds of years, you start to get these boulders, and then limestone and sandstone, and then fossil reefs. Over time, this coral reef succession process, will continue to move forward as we get inception reefs, and then we have these lateral extensions of the reef material, the rock material. And then finally, down here at the bottom, we get coral reef structures where we have the growth of the organisms and the many creatures that it will eventually start to evolve and live there. They begin to appear. So this process is actually very important because, as you know, many of the coral reefs that we have around the world contain endangered species, or they are become polluted because of man. And a lot of this succession, or these succession processes, we find are taking place in many of the coral reefs underwater because of stuff that man has done to pollute the water.
Now, you have completed the succession notes at this point. So, if you are in my honors classes, that's periods 1, 3, and 4, you all need to work on the succession packet that has been given to you. If you are in my advanced classes, that's periods 2, 6, and 7, you all will need to use your electronic device and go to Google Classroom and enter the code. Once you enter the code for your class, you will see 3 assignments. You are to complete assignments 1 and 2. That again, so if you're in my honors classes, you're going to receive a succession packet that you will work on in class today. And then you will, if you're in my advanced classes, you will use your electronic device to log into Google Classroom. And then you will put in the class code so that you can access the succession assignments number 1 and number 2, and those two need to be completed online.